can all see my first slide here, which is the front cover of my new book, The Lost Rainforests of Britain. It may at first glance look like a photo, but actually it's a beautiful watercolour by the fantasy artist Alan Lee, who's better known for illustrating the works of Tolkien. And I first met Alan about a year ago, or slightly more, as he lives on the edges of Dartmoor and has always been inspired by Dartmoor's amazing wet woodlands. And when I realised that he'd been essentially inspired by some of Britain's rainforests to depict creatures like the Ents in Lord of the Rings, I knew I had to not only speak to him and interview him for the book, but also ask him cheekily if he would illustrate the front cover to my book. So as they say, don't judge a book on its cover. Well, please do judge my book on this cover, because it's probably the best thing about it. But I wanted to start by talking really about how I got interested in rainforests. And it started a long time ago. When I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, the big cause célèbre of the Western environmental movement was the Save the Rainforests campaign. And this was, of course, a big international effort movement to save the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and other tropical rainforests. And I remember when I was about 5 years old, my mum organised a Save the Rainforest fundraiser party for Friends of the Earth. And we painted a big poster with colourful toucans and parrots on it to try and, highlight the plight of the rainforests. And it's a moment that stayed with me. I later went on to work for Friends of the Earth as a campaigner later in life. And obviously, the battle to save the world's tropical rainforests remains incredibly urgent, and has obviously been on our minds, I think, recently with the defeat, thankfully, of President Bolsonaro in Brazil and the re-election of Lula da Silva, whose victory is a real ray of hope for tropical rainforests, because he has pledged to end deforestation in the Amazon. But I guess what I didn't realize when I was growing up and when I began campaigning for Friends of the Earth was actually how Britain has rainforests too. It might feel and sound like a slightly outlandish claim, but ecologists agree that we have rainforests here too, right under our noses. And let me just show you a picture of one of them. This is Black-Tor Copse on Dartmoor. You can see here this wonderful ancient gnarled woodland teeming with epiphytic plants, which are really one of the defining characteristics of our rainforests, those tentacular octopoid limbs reaching out from the ancient gnarled trunks of these oak trees. And when we think about tropical rainforests, very clearly they're rainy and they're hot. And what we have in Britain are temperate rainforests, which are rainy but cool. And they're actually even rarer than tropical rainforests. They only cover about 1% of the world's surface. And whilst I was had to take some persuading that we did have rainforests in Britain, once I started exploring them and thinking about it, actually, Britain is obviously such a rainy little country. We're stereotypically obsessed by how rainy our weather is. And after a while, it started to seem to me that actually it's not at all surprising that we have rainforests at all. They've evolved to take advantage of this very rainy weather and climate that we have. And I live in Devon and in Dartmoor, where conditions are pretty perfect for rainforests, temperate rainforests to evolve and to thrive. By one definition, the threshold for temperate rainforest starts where you get to about 1,400 millimeters of rainfall in a year on average, which is, when you think about it, nearly 1.5 meters is quite a lot of rainfall. But that's what we get on Dartmoor and indeed along large stretches of the west of Britain. And I think my next slide shows you a bit more of a sense of where we get temperate rainforests occurring in a big swathe from Cornwall through Devon, up through Wales, up to the Lake District, up through Galloway, Dumfries, and to Argyll and the Western Highlands. And as you can see from this map here, the one here on the left, that actually our rainforest zone in Britain covers quite a large area, around 20% of the country. But in fact, what is left is much, much less, unfortunately. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, I just wanted to give you a bit more of a flavour of what we find in our temperate rainforests. What really defines them are these epiphytes. They are plants that grow on other plants. They survive and thrive on the fact that there's enough rainfall, enough moisture, enough nutrients coming from the rainfall. That means that these plants can grow on the trunks and branches of the trees in our temperate rainforest. They don't have to be anchored in the ground in order to get enough moisture and enough nutrients. And so these are a couple of examples of the sorts of species we get in our temperate rainforest. Some of them more rarer and more exotic and interesting and charismatic microflora, as I like to call them. We hear a lot in conservation about charismatic megafauna, people talking about pandas and lions and tigers. These are all very important parts of ecosystems as well. But I also think that we really need to remember the plants, the fungi, ultimately the organisms that allow all the other creatures that we so love and cherish to survive. And I think one of my first abiding memories of going into one of Britain's temperate rainforests was really how green it all was. And obviously all woods in Britain are green in summer, but temperate rainforests are green all year round because of this absolute, abundance of epiphytes, of mosses, lichens, ferns, all clinging and festooning trees and giving them this sort of green aura. You get polypody ferns, which kind of give this sort of halo to the branches of temperate rainforest trees. You get lichens like tree lungwort, pictured here, Lobaria pulmonaria, which is so named because of its reputed herbal medicinal properties, or thought that was what was thought by medieval herbalists. I'm not sure there's actually any evidence that it was a cure for lung disease, but that's how it's got its name. To very weird denizens of our temperate rainforest, like hazel gloves fungus, pictured here in orange, this very orange glove-like, mitten-like fungus that grabs hold of branches, and I think is an absolutely amazing organism to find. And Britain's temperate rainforests are ecologically world-beating. They really support over 500 species of lichens, 160 species of mosses and liverworts. They're kind of arguably the pinnacle of Britain's woodlands and a vital part of the biodiversity of these islands since the last ice age. And it's also they're also incredibly important because of the amount of carbon they soak up. Obviously, all woodlands are locking up carbon in their trunks, in the woody matter that makes up their branches and in forest floors, but our temperate rainforests are arguably also adding to the carbon stock in our woods through the soil that's forming in the canopy of these forests, because so many generations of bryophytes, of mosses, liverworts live and die on these branches that they form this soil-like crust in the upper canopy of the trees, which adds to the carbon that they're locking up in the air. So they really are really vital allies in the fight against the climate crisis. But tragically, Britain is a rainforest nation that cut down most of its rainforests. And whilst much of this took place a long time ago, back as long ago as the Bronze Age, when settlers started to fell the ancient wildwood to clear land for farming, unforgivably, I think some of our rainforests were cut down as recently as the 20th century. And that was as a result of misguided forestry practices that saw them as economically useless, as mere scrub that needed to be felled to make way for productive timber, basically pine monocultures that contributed to many of our ancient woodlands being felled between the 1950s and the 1980s. What actually stops our temperate rainforests from returning, however, is something else. And it's pictured in this slide here. It is the sheep. And we have large numbers of sheep in Britain these days, have done since the 20th century, particularly since farm subsidies started to incentivize increased herd density, increased herd numbers, something called headage payments, which we used to have under the Common Agricultural Policy. And sheep, as a non-native species to Britain, don't just nibble the grass, they also love nibbling young saplings as well. And that means that they really affect the natural regeneration of woodlands and particularly of temperate rainforests. And if you ever thought that the number of sheep in our countryside is normal and natural, I have to disabuse you of that notion. Unfortunately, we are, Britain has some of the highest stocking densities of sheep in Europe, if not in the world. In Wales, there are 3 times as many sheep as people. And it's particularly a high stocking density in our western upland areas, which is the areas that have the right climate for temperate rainforest. And that's actually no coincidence, because if you talk to any farmer, they'll quite rightly say that the west of Britain is good for growing grass. But the problem is, and the thing is the west of Britain is even better for growing rainforest. So axes, chainsaws, sheep, and deer have reduced Britain's rainforests from an ecosystem that covered maybe 1/5 of Britain's landmass once upon a time to something considerably less than 1% of the country today. And that's a tragedy. But I think even worse is the fact that few people nowadays are even aware of the existence of Britain's rainforests. There's an ecologist called Dominic Della Sala who has written that, and I quote, "Because very few rainforests remain throughout Europe, those undertaking rescue efforts today operate much like detectives in search of clues." And more broadly, we suffer in modern society from something that's been termed plant blindness, which is, a kind of a malady in which something that I suffered from certainly until a few years back, when I started trying to learn the names of wildflowers and talking to more botanists and naturalists, just to kind of understand better what I was seeing, which was a blur of green, and not really distinguishing between the sheer myriad variety of plants that we have in Britain. I just wanted to say a little bit more, though, not just about the ecological importance of our temperate rainforests, but also about their cultural importance. And I think that's something else that makes them incredibly valuable and something that's really worth preserving and restoring. When I started researching our temperate rainforests, I realized that actually they've been woven into some of our oldest myths and legends, and have inspired some of our greatest writers and poets. So I looked at, for example, the Mabinogion, the ancient Welsh myths, or collection of myths. And the first 4 books of the Mabinogion are known as the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, which is the structure itself suggesting a tree. And they recount, amongst other tales, the story of the Welsh wizard Gwydion, whose name means woodwise, or possibly born of trees, and whose character seems to contain an echo of the Celtic Druids, whose name is also derived from the Atlantic oakwoods, the Celtic deru, which means oak, and id, meaning knowledge, so druid or deruid translates as oak seer. And Gwydion, the shape-shifting magician of the Mabinogion, features in many stories that demonstrate the power and importance of the Atlantic rainforests to the people who sang and later wrote down these stories. In one, Gwydion takes the flowers of the oak and the flowers of the broom and the flowers of the meadowsweet, and conjures a woman out of these flowers called Blodeuwedd, who becomes another central character in the stories. And another Welsh poem in which Gwydion features is called The Battle of the Trees. And if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings movies, you'll know the last march of the Ents, in which Treebeard leads the Ents to defend Fangorn Forest. And in the Battle of the Trees, this is a kind of a telling of this story 2,000 years, more or less, perhaps before Tolkien wrote it down, which is around how Gwydion, the wizard, animated an entire forest to rise up against the forces of the Celtic otherworld who were invading our world. I think it's stories like these that add to this sense of how enchanting these places are and have been for many generations of people. And I really want to, in writing this book, I really wanted to help re-enchant people with the magic of our rainforests. I think they're hugely important, both ecologically and culturally. And I hope that by collectively remembering them, by seeing them again, seeing them afresh, we can not only appreciate them for what they are, but also start that process of restoring them. So I hope you've been inspired by this little taster of our temperate rainforests. I speak a lot more about them, obviously, in my book. And I hope you'll join me in helping to restore and bring back Britain's lost rainforests.